This video not only demonstrates how to use the inverter tank for inverting the plastic through the liner, but also the differences in the setup of the liner and how each of the ends is prepared to be able to use that inverter tank. The liner length is basically the same length as it normally would be made as if you were doing a standard wet out. The first thing you notice though is that on the pull end, the release plastic is not attached in and banded with the rest of the material. The air end is done exactly the same way. Notice they tape over top of the bands, but the release plastic is not banded in to the end at all. The air test is performed exactly the same as with a standard wet out. Bladder is brought up to contact pressure and listen for any leaks. The retrieval measurements are still made up exactly the same way. Stretch out the camera beside the tail end of the liner. The winch cable is then tape marked for its retrieval length, as well as the air line. Lay the liner out straight, then pull the rubber bladder out of the liner. Start with the air end first, laying it down, and then folding back and forth on top of it until you reach the pull end. The rubber must be kept out of the sun and in a place where it will not be stepped on. Pull the rope out of the tank to ensure there is at least 5 feet more rope than liner that you are trying to invert through. For example, 75 feet of liner would require 80 feet of inversion rope. When reeling the rope back into the tank, make sure it runs evenly back and forth along the spool surface. Make sure the air valve is in the off position before attaching any air lines to it. Tie a slip knot around the end of the release plastic that's inside the liner. Then take electrical tape and tape between the rope and the release plastic to make sure that the release plastic does not come off the rope during the inversion process. Using a spray bottle of either baby oil or vegetable oil, spray down the release plastic as it gets rolled inside the inversion tank. Keep a slight amount of tension on the release plastic. This keeps it tight in the tank and also takes out any excess air that's inside the release plastic. The end of the release plastic is then folded back over top of the snout to the inversion tank. In this case, the snout and the release plastic are both 3-inch, so the release plastic needs to be stretched over top of the end of the snout. Once this has been done, the electrical tape is then used to seal between the release plastic and the snout to the tank. A tail is left on the end of your electrical tape to be able to remove it quickly after the inversion process has happened. On the pull end, take about 2 feet of release plastic and slide it over the end of the liner until it is flush with the end of the liner. On the air end, you'll want to take approximately 2.5 to 3 feet of release plastic and slide it halfway onto the end of the liner. This will catch the excess epoxy after wet out. Since there is no bladder inside the liner during wet out, There are epoxy charts made specifically for wetting out without a bladder inside it. Notice how the pull end release plastic that we slid on gets folded back onto itself to allow the roller and the epoxy to push right up against the pull end. This ensures that the wet out is complete all the way to the very end of the felt. This allows for a very clean wet out at the end of the liner. You do not have to work the end of the liner by hand to be able to complete the wet out. The air end release plastic is then folded over so that the exact same method can be used at that end. The air end release plastic is then stretched out straight, and the excess epoxy is then rolled out into that release plastic. For start and stop lining, we have to make cutouts in our liner. Traditionally, with our regular wet out, we have to be very careful with cutting into the liner as to not damage the release plastic or the bladder. In this case, there is no bladder or release plastic inside the liner. We want to cut through about 75% of the liner, leaving a 1-inch strip in the middle to hold the liner together while we invert the plastic through. Notice there's 8 inches of felt between the inverter tank and the liner. This allows for excess plastic to end up at the pull end for when we pull the bladder through. Turning the air valve on starts the inversion process. Because the release plastic is so thin, the liner must be kept straight to be able to invert the plastic through the liner. Once the release plastic has exited out the air end of the liner, cut open the plastic to retrieve the rope that's running through the center of the release plastic. This rope gets tied to the pull end of the rubber bladder. Make sure it's tied securely so that it will not come undone when we pull the bladder through the release plastic. While the rope is being pulled from the tank end, feed the retaining sleeve and the rubber bladder into the liner while holding the plastic tight. Pull slowly to make sure that the pull end comes out the same amount that you originally had out when you air tested the bladder. Remove the rope and electrical tape the release plastic onto the pull end. On a start and stop liner, we must finish cutting out where the connections will end up. Cut the 1-inch piece on the top of both sides of the cutout. Cut lengthwise down between those two cutouts, and then cut the bottom 1-inch strip. Place the piece of cutout felt directly in front of the cutout. This is to verify the cutout length when we go to tape up the liner. Taping up the liner is the same no matter which way you wet out the liner. Since this liner will be pulled around a couple of 90-degree elbows, it will be tri-folded for ease of installation. After the liner is taped up, it will be folded into a carry bin. The air end of the liner goes in the bin first, and then folded back and forth until the pull end is on top so it can be pulled in first. Since this is a 3-inch line and there are cutouts on it, the camera gets installed with the liner as it gets pulled inside to confirm the position of the cutouts. Once the liner has been pulled in to our retrieval measurement, we check with the camera. We want to make sure that the gap in the liner matches up with the connection in the pipe. Sometimes the connection is not visible, but the joints in the pipe on either side of that fitting are visible. Therefore, we line up the gap in the liner with the joints on either side of the connection. Once all the connections have been verified, pull the camera out and inflate the liner to the required PSI. This concludes how to set up the liner, how to set up the inverter tank, and how to invert the plastic through the liner. This makes the wet out much cleaner and much quicker, especially in longer lengths. For that reason, if the liner is less than 15 feet long, just do a standard wet out.